Thank you, Mr. President. I have come to the floor today to speak about a measure that we have moved through the Energy and Natural Resources Committee. This is a pretty significant bipartisan accomplishment and something that I'd like to share with colleagues. On the 19th of November, our committee reported S556. We refer to it as the Sportsmen's Act. This is a measure that I have been working on. We were able to report it out by voice vote. But this is a bill, Mr. President, that will benefit millions of sportsmen and sportswomen all across our country. It includes some key items within our jurisdiction that are part of a broader sportsman's package. That portion is being worked by another committee, but I have been working our iteration of this bill with Senator Heinrich of New Mexico and truly appreciate his leadership, his support, and his guidance on it. As many members here in this chamber are aware, the broader sportsman's bill has had a long history of bipartisan support here in the Senate, but year after year it's failed to advance for a host of different reasons. Perhaps the victim of political brinksmanship in what for years was just a chamber that wasn't working here. But I think that this year is different, and I outlined some of the successes yesterday when I came to speak on the floor, but I think we're getting back to regular order. The committees are working hard. Certainly the Energy and Natural Resources Committee is working hard, and we're working to advance legislation to go to the floor, whether it's this Sportsman's Bill or whether it's our Energy Policy Modernization Act that we reported out of the committee on an 18-4 margin back in July. But our Sportsmen's Act is the latest example of a bipartisan bill that encompasses both good policy and good process. And I think both of those are key. Staff from both sides of our committee and the Sportsmen's Caucus, which is led by Senator Risch as well as Senator Manchin, they work diligently with outside stakeholders to improve and refine it. First, we included a congressional declaration of national policy to require all federal agencies and departments to facilitate the expansion and the enhancement of hunting, fishing, and recreational shooting on federal lands. This is our clear goal. It's pretty clear and explicit direction for the executive branch. And then the next component within the bill, and this is really the heart of the bill, is a provision that we're referring to as open unless closed. And through these, what we're doing is we're setting a new national standard. And that standard is that our federal lands will be open unless they are closed. They're going to be open unless they're closed, not closed until they're opened by opened by bureaucratic inertia. So what we're trying to do here is pretty simple. We're trying to allow all Americans to be able to access and enjoy their public lands. And under our bill, if federal lands are going to be even temporarily closed, agencies will have to notify the public and provide opportunities for meaningful public comment. The agencies, whether they be the BLM or the Forest Service, will need to justify any proposed closures and address issues that have been raised by the public. Our bill will also prevent temporary closures from becoming permanent by limiting any of these designations to just 180 days. Currently, what we see is BLM can close lands for 2 years and does not guarantee the opportunity for any public comment. BLM has acknowledged to us that they regularly implement what they call temporary closures to prepare the paperwork to basically make them permanent. And so my Sportsmen's Act will allow BLM and the Forest Service to renew temporary closures, but they can only do it up to 3 times. But each and every time that they do so, we're going to require them to engage in the public comment and the notification process. What this does, what this open unless closed policy does, is it reverses the practice of public lands being closed until opened or closed altogether. And as a result of it, our sportsmen and sportswomen will have increased access to our public lands. They'll have a real voice in decisions regarding any temporary closure, and they'll also receive justifications for any temporary closures that are deemed necessary. So really a more fulsome public process, but also a more genuine opportunity for access to our public lands. My Sportsmen's Bill also addresses concerns raised about the unnecessary difficulty of securing permission for commercial filming on our public lands. Among other steps in the bill, we require the publication of a single joint land use fee schedule within 100 days, but we also say there's small enough crews that you shouldn't have to go through this big rigmarole, pay this big fee. We exempt small film crews of 3 or few people from having to pay a fee. I've heard a lot of stories about the horrors of some of our outfitters or guides that they have experienced while they're trying to film some kind of a promo type material on a trip. And again, the hoops that they've got to go through. The agencies are telling them that they need a separate permit, they've got to pay the fees. It gets to the point where you can't take a video, you can't take a picture. These are our public lands. That's just wrong. That's not what this was designed to do. These folks already have a permit to be out there, and filming may just be incidental to that. So what we do in this bill is we ensure that small crews and businesses can film on public lands without having to pay to do it. Seems pretty reasonable, seems pretty fair. We also protect First Amendment rights by preventing content from becoming a factor in issuance of permits, and we protect free speech by clarifying that journalism is not a commercial activity. And some might say, what's this issue all about? Well, think about it. If you have an agency that doesn't want to have filming or pictures in a certain part of a wilderness area or a certain part of public lands, and because they might tell a different story than what the agency might want to, that's not right either. We're not going to be regulating content here in terms of whether or not a permit is issued. I'll give you an example, a specific example of why this is needed. Back in 2014, a producer with Oregon Public Broadcasting wanted to film a piece in the Willamette National Forest to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Wilderness Act, and to ensure that the piece had the primary purpose of dissemination of information about the use and enjoyment of wilderness. Officials from the Forest Service asked to review the script. They wanted to look at the script before issuing a permit. Mr. President, giving federal officials veto power over content, I believe, could have a very chilling effect on journalism. Again, this is just not how it should work. Now, the final title of my Sportsmen's Act, this is a new title that we added in committee, provides for the reauthorization of and reforms to the Land and Water Conservation Fund, LWCF. The reforms in the bill don't go as far as I would like to see them go, but they do reflect what our committee could agree on. We've also agreed to reauthorize the Historic Preservation Fund and to create a fund to address the maintenance backlog at the National Park Service. This is the same language that we included in our broad bipartisan energy bill that we passed out of the committee back in July. So same language now incorporated as part of the Sportsmen's Bill. But as I've said before, my own proposal to reauthorize LWCF would look different than what our committee has reported. When LWCF was created some decades ago, monies were to be allocated each year so that federal agencies, the federal agencies, would receive no less than 40%. States were to receive 60%. But what has happened in these ensuing years is nearly 85% of LWCF dollars have gone to federal land acquisition. And the original congressional intent we're just not seeing being met. Again, keep in mind, when it was first created, it was going to be federal agencies get about 40%, states get about 60%. We've now turned that on its head, turned it on its head. So what our LWCF title does is recognize that states are leaders on recreation and conservation. Our reforms are trying to balance the state-federal split by ensuring that at least 40% of LWCF dollars be allocated to states for the state-based programs, including the traditional stateside program. This is an improvement in my mind, but I still don't think it goes far enough to restore that original congressional intent. The title also recognizes the importance of accessing existing federal lands, and it sets aside the greater of 1.5% or $10 million per year to improve access for sportsmen. So again, an important provision for our sportsmen and women. Like many Western members, I remain concerned about unfettered land acquisition by our federal government. And in Alaska, close to 63% of our lands are already controlled by the federal government. And so to begin to address the issue, the LWCF title also emphasizes conservation easements. And this will keep lands in private ownership as working lands, as well as require agencies to take into account certain considerations when acquiring lands, including whether the acquisition would result in management efficiencies and cost savings. To prioritize the backlog of deferred maintenance needs, the title also establishes a National Park Service Maintenance and Revitalization Conservation Fund. This fund will help shift our focus, I think, to a more appropriate place, which is taking care of the lands that we already have, rather than an endless acquisition of new acreage. Mr. President, our country is fortunate to have an abundance of lands that are designated for recreation, conservation, and preservation. And it's time that we reach a consensus on how to care for and to manage them. And I believe that we can do that best by allocating more than 40% of the LWCF to state-based programs. People on the ground provide the greatest insight into management, and we should recognize that. We should pair increased funding for state-based programs with increased authority for states to manage public lands. And we should consider giving governors a say on federal land acquisition. It is, these are their states that we're talking about, and opportunities for all sorts of activities on their land that are often affected by these decisions. The LWCF reforms in the Sportsmen's Bill, I think, are a step in the right direction. I think they provide a good framework for further discussion. And I think if we work hard and we work together, we can agree on some additional reforms that will make LWCF even more effective in the years to come. Those of us on the Energy Committee have now completed our work on the Sportsmen's Bill, and that brings us to the next step, which will be taken by our friends on the Environment and Public Works Committee. They're now considering a separate bill. This is S659, with the provisions that are jurisdictional to them. I think it's fair to say that EPW's portion of the Sportsmen's Bill are also quite vital. There's one provision that I'd like to call attention to briefly, and that's the reauthorization of the North American Wetlands Conservation Act. The NACA program helps conserve waterfowl, fish, wildlife through partnerships involving governments, nonprofits, and community groups. Now, in Alaska, we're not in any danger of running out of wetlands at any time, but this project, or this program, has funded a lot of good projects in my state. For example, on the Kenai Peninsula, partners in the private sector provided $1.6 million to match and exceed an $800,000 grant provided through NACA. And those funds were then used to implement habitat protection for over 300 acres of land along the Kenai River. I think it's important that we reauthorize this program and we provide funding to it so that we can see important work like this continue, particularly in states that have fewer wetlands and do have that greater need for conservation. But NACA is just one of the provisions the EPW committee can and hopefully will report in the near future. And then once their work is complete, all who support America's sportsmen and sportswomen, all of us here in this Senate who are sportsmen and women ourselves, should look forward to considering the full Sportsmen's Act here on the floor next year. I am pleased that it looks like we're on a better track for this legislation in the 114th Congress. I want to again thank all the many members who have worked with us to get the bill to where it is today. As a result of this good work, millions of hunters, fishermen, recreational shooters, and other outdoor enthusiasts will soon have greater access and clearly greater opportunities on our public lands, on our federal lands, and I think that's something that we should all be proud to support.